at the museum. Well, that's good because I tell this story on every one of the private tours.
Did you know you could get a private tour in the museum?
I did one. I did my first one since COVID this morning. Had 10 people on it. Anyway, in 1964, we started getting the new HEMI engine. We were the 392 was the engine of choice of all the racers. I mean, we had that thing fine-tuned down to the nth degree, and they were running about 210 miles an hour in the 775, say, and they were very reliable. But they didn't make them anymore at the factory, and they had come out with this 426, and it was built for NASCAR, and so it was a heavy-duty, much heavier engine than the 392, big pistons, higher compression, short stroke. And they sent us a bunch of them. I wished I had some of the originals. Some of the very first ones I had that were actually manufactured in 1963 by Chrysler. We just threw them in the dumpster. They were so bad. So anyway, we built this car, Swamp Rat 8, and we put the 426 in it, and we did some testing, and it ran about 815, 190 miles an hour. That's about all it would do. But we carried it to California with us for the 1965 U.S. Fuel and Gas Championships, which was the big race back then. And it paid $7,500 to win, and that was a lot of money in 1965. So at Swamp Rat 6B, the very cars in the museum, won a 64-car field on Saturday. That's 6 rounds. Never taking the pan off, never taking the head off. It was just, you run as fast as, we started the race at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and finished at 5. 6 rounds of top fuel, and I won that. And then that gave me the right to set out while a 32-car field ran on Sunday, and that winner of that had to race me for the $7,500. And on top of that, there was 120 top fuel dragsters entered in this event. It was the biggest show ever for top fuel dragsters. The car that won on Sunday was the Garlett's Chassis Special, and that chassis is the chassis that's under the Dodge Dart in the museum. It's been modified slightly, but that was the chassis. Marvin Swartz was the driver. He won that. So then we raced each other, and I won the overall championship. But they had a 16-car consolation field for the group, the 16 next cars, slower than the 32-car field on Sunday, to give them something to race for. So they raced for like $2,500, that group. And the 32-car field, the winner of that got $5,000. So it was a big payoff. So the Swamp Rat 8 was runner-up in the consolation race with like a 813, 192 miles an hour. So we come back to Tampa, and my boss at Chrysler says, "Don, I want you in the 426 car. We don't make 392s anymore." I said, "Frank, it don't run as good." He said, "It ain't never gonna run as good until you get in it and tune it." I said, "We've done everything in the world to it." I said, "It's just too heavy, and there's no water in the head, so we're getting detonation down course. I don't know what to do about all that." He said, "You'll figure it out. We want you in the 392 car. I mean, in the 426 car." So I painted out the Swamp Rat 8 and put winch jammer on it, and out I went. 2 years I struggled with that thing. The Greek with his 392 car beat me in 23 straight match races, and it just really, I couldn't hardly get over it, because my whole deal in those days was the match races. My notoriety, famous beating these people at all these little podunk strips, because we only had 3 or 4 national events a year then. So finally, it all came to a head at Columbus, Ohio, at National Trails Raceway. It was a Saturday night. I'm racing Jim and Allison Lee, 2 out of 3. I make all 3 runs. I win the race. I have top speed and low ET, but it's an 8:13, 192 miles an hour. And I go up to get my $1,250, and Clark Radar Sr. is sitting there at his desk. That big old moose was over. I don't know whether anybody's ever seen that before, but he had a big old moose that he'd killed over his dead. The thing was overwhelming. And he's sitting there and he's got a .45 caliber service pistol, which was my sidearm in the military, so I knew what that was. And he slides $500 across the table and puts his hand over on the pistol and puts his finger right on the trigger and points it straight at me and says, "I'm cutting your money, $750 you laid down on me tonight." I said, "Mr. Radar, how could you say that? I made all 3 runs, I'm top speed, low ET, and I won the race." He says, "You didn't go 200, you're saving it for tomorrow, and you've made a fool out of me. I advertise 200 miles an hour, you run 192 miles an hour, take your $500, get out of here, and don't ever come back." And his hand was just shaking on his damn pistol. So I went down to back to the pits, and I told the 2 kids that was helping me, Jim Marone and Bob Taft, that's who it was. What he didn't, and Bob Taft was a mean son of a gun. He says, "I'll go up to the tower and get the 750. I says, "You won't. You go up to the tower, he's going to shoot you. The man's crazy." So we loaded up, and we did have a match race the next day at Rockford, Illinois. So we're driving across the country which is not a bad drive, 4 or 5 hours. And I says to the boys, I says, "I'm going to blow this engine up tomorrow, and then we're going back to Florida and get my 392 stuff." I said, "What good is free engines if they don't run good?" And Bob says, "How you going to blow it up, Big Daddy? We ain't put a rod bearing in it all year." And actually, I hadn't put a rod bearing in it almost 2 years. It was indestructible. I said, "I'm going to put some spark lead in it." We had 34 degrees in this motor because that's exactly what it took to make the 392 run perfect. If you put any more than that, it would crack a cylinder wall and the engine was no good anymore. You had to put a new block in it. See, those engines were old. That was back in '57 when they cast. But think of all the water and stuff that'd been in those water jackets, rust in the inside of them. And the 426 wasn't like that, but we wasn't thinking about that. So anyway, very carefully at Rockford, Illinois, with my buzz box, I put 40 degrees in it. Because 40 degrees if you were in a really bad race and it was the final and you just had to win, you could put 40 degrees in your 392 and it would pep it up that one run and then get ready to get a new block. But I raced lots of guys that put 40 degrees in for the final because they wanted to win so bad. But what would happen mostly down toward the end when the cylinder walls started to split and everything, they'd slow down and I'd drive around them. So anyway, I put 40 degrees in this big turkey and we went to the starting line. It was sounding pretty good, not like I'd ever heard it before. It had a cackle to it. I stepped down on that thing and I took the ride of my life. 213 miles an hour, 7.51 seconds. And I knew it was a good run, but we come by the time shack and got the ticket. I said, "Oh my God." And I figured it must be real because it was difficult in those days to have a printout so they could make up a time, the announcer, and because nobody sees the clock. But when you have the printout and it prints out, it's more than likely true. So they handed me the ticket, 213 miles an hour, 751. But I wasn't even thinking about that so much. I had to make at least 2 runs to get my money. So we rushed back to the pits and put it up on nitro cans and dropped the pan real quick to see how bad it was hurt. I couldn't believe it when the pan come down. First of all, the oil didn't even have any nitro in it, and there was absolutely no water in it. It was just as clear as crystal. I pulled a couple of rod bearings down, and everything looked brand new. We took it back together, put the pan, didn't even change the oil, just put the same pan right back up with the oil in it. And I very carefully put the 40 degrees in it. Now, mind you, this time I took the half-inch combination wrench and loosened the mag hold down and just gave it a twist, tightened it back up. Later, when I checked it, I had put 12 more degrees in it. It now had 52 degrees, which just happens by a coincidence to be exactly what the top fuel and funny cars run today when they go through the lights, 52 degrees. Now they start with a lot more, but the computer pulls it back. We started that thing up. The two boys that normally would come up and put their hands on the cylinder heads wouldn't even get near it. It was belching flames and shaking the ground, you know, and they just go to the starting line quick. It's going to blow up any minute. I stepped down on that thing, and I'll tell you what, it was a shot heard around the world. 219.84 miles an hour, 7.31 seconds. At Indianapolis, that same engine in a different chassis, Swamp Rat 11, went 223 miles an hour in 6.77 seconds. And the beauty of it all was nothing was hurt. It loved it. That big chamber had to have more spark lead. And the engine was so strong it could take it. The following Monday morning, of course, I called Frank Wiley that night. I called him right at home. My boss at Chrysler had told him what I'd done, and he laughed. He said, "I told you it was a better engine, you just wouldn't listen to me." I said, "I just couldn't bring myself to put that kind of lead in it, Frank. I thought it would just destroy it." And of course it didn't. Keith Black, which was the big 392, 354 engine guy on the West Coast, that's what he did. He built, his main business was supplying 392s and 354s for boat racing, hydroplane racing. He did have two engines, one in the Greer Black and Prudhomme car and one in Roland Leong's Hawaiian. So he did have two drag racing customers. He called Centerline, that was the Chrysler depot in Detroit, and he said, "I would like to become the West Coast dealer for the 426 HEMIs." And the parts Centerline guy said, "You heard about those runs that Garlett's made yesterday?" And he said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "It's my understanding that he didn't hurt anything." And the guy at Centerline said, "That's right, he didn't hurt nothing." And so Keith Black says, "What is it going to take for me to be the West Coast dealer?" And they said, "You're going to have to take a tractor trailer load of 426s. And Keith Black said, "Send them." And of course, later he made an aluminum block, you know, with a Chrysler part number on it. But that was it. That was the end of the 392s. Once we figured that out, they were history. Those 426s were just something else. I never forget the first one I actually saw running on a dyno was at Cotton Owens' place. And I used to park there all the time because he was right by the airport and he had a big parking lot and he would let me use his shop. So that was like a East Coast stopover for us. So he had just got these 426s. This was early on. Of course, on gasoline. On gasoline, they didn't run much lead in them, only about 30 degrees, you know. And so he had this thing on the dyno, and these engines were supposed to be 425 horse from the factory. And he had blueprinted this engine, but it was still legal NASCAR, and it was running about 6,500 RPM, 440 horsepower. And it was making a big racket, you know, and he'd run it up 2 or 3 times and run it back and look at it. Then he got it settled in, and it was running just 6,500 and just a steady scream, you know. It had these big mufflers, but it was still noisy as it could be. And he turned to me and he said, "Let's go have lunch," and started walking away from the dyno. And I said, "Cotton, are you going to leave that engine running while we go to lunch? He said, oh yeah. He said, if it's still running when we get back, it'll be a good one. And it was still running when we got back. See, the engineers at Chrysler wanted an engine that would make the same horsepower on the final run of the Daytona 500 that it made on the first lap. In other words, they wanted that engine to be so strong and it would hold itself, all the integrity of the machining and everything would be perfect all the way through the 500 miles. And so they had to build a lot of internal strength into the motor. Well, that's what we needed in the nitromethane. We needed that strength so it wouldn't move around. And I mean, just think today, the same engine, the configuration, the bolt pattern and everything is still the same as it was then on those Top Fuel motors that they use in Funny Car and Top Fuel.